France in the year 1789. King Louis XVI just prevented the storming of the Bastille with an army of autonomous soul-eating steel automata. I think I have to get my history notes right.
Oh, pardon. You know, actually, I think I'm in no mood for games right now.
Steelrising plays in an alternative universe where that just happened.
All is not lost.
You play as Aegis, a doll, and your mission is to stop the king.
You are made of neither flesh nor blood. You are an automat like those who committed this massacre.
I have received no such command. I am carrying out a mission on the orders of the Queen.
Let's talk about the combat. It's a Soulslike. Next section. Jokes aside, Steelrising has a similar combat to Dark Souls and Neo. Strong and weak attacks, charge attacks, stagger and dodging. What I don't like is unannounced hyper armor. Sometimes you stagger the enemy, but then suddenly your opponent decides it has enough and ignores your attacks and attacks you. It feels like it builds resistance against stagger, which in itself is not a bad idea. But the enemy sometimes decides this so quick that you have little time to react to its counterattack. What I really like is how the combat changes entirely depending on your loadout. Some weapons give you a block, others a parry or a counterattack. You can have range weapons and even elemental effects, like freezing or burning. There are also not many different weapon types. Steelrising in that regard feels like the first Bloodborne-like instead of a Souls-like. For example, while two weapons might have the same animations and around the same base damage, they can have elemental damage or instead of a block a range attack or a parry. In Dark Souls, it always felt like the only three types are magic, with and without a shield, and the rest just plays the same.
Let's not claim victory too soon, Maximilian.
Steelrising also has very little hitbox problems. What's also of little quantity is sadly the enemy variety. You will largely fight the same enemies everywhere, but often under enough different conditions that it makes up for the lack of variety. Almost. The combat is overall solid, not the best Souls-like iteration, but definitely not the worst.
I don't know how to describe it. A vrai dire.
What's at the same time the most interesting and disappointing part is the world and level design. Let's start with negativity, so the section ends on a positive note. Although the game plays in a historical setting, there's little variety in the game. I'm not talking about that you only play in a large city, even though that is also an issue, but that each street and most buildings look the same. The same shops, the same corners. Each building was copied and pasted, which counteracts the historical setting. Strangely enough, this feels similar to Hellgate London, with its streets that are always the same. Your movement options, however, are interesting. You can jump and even pretty high. Use different routes to your destination, and for every Dark Souls 1 fan, there's an interconnected level design that does make sense. So I guess this game has no flaws and is perfect because having two shortcuts in the level counters all criticism and makes this game so much more better.
Et bien voilà. It is just as I suspected.
This game also has Metroidvania DNA. After most bosses you get special abilities, both for combat and for movement, for example, the grappling hook. With these items you can go back and get loot. A little sour note here is that the loot is almost never worth it. It just does not feel right. If you take care to remember inaccessible locations, then travel back to them, ignore or fight the enemies en route, and then you get a consumable bomb. Even though most of the streets are the same, some locations are beautiful recreations of history, and it's incredible how the machine revolution changed the look of most places.
Naturally, that makes all the difference.
Speaking of history, you find and talk to several historical figures, like Lafayette or Robespierre. I googled many of them, and in my earliest draft I wanted to talk about how this game changes their characters, but given the alternative universe they are in, it's understandable if they are different. It's silly to complain that Lafayette is portrayed wrong if giant mecha soldiers destroy the streets of Paris. I won't go into the story because fairly spoken, it's underwhelming. It's literally just save this guy, now save this guy, now find a way into X. It's probably more interesting for French people. Spiders, the developers, have their HQ in Paris after all. But for me it's just name drop after name drop, with very little connection to myself.
Ah, that is unfortunate. Most unfortunate.
Of course, sadly I have to talk about the polish of the game, or the lack of. It's prone to crashing, freezing and staggering. It's like me reading through the critical table of my pen and paper system. Sometimes it's just slight lagging, but I had far more crashes than excusable. What I want to point out is that the bugs and polish are a bit overestimated in our time. It feels like most people can't wait to play a game, and it has to be done at the release, and there is no forgiving. This also affected the Steam ratings, and I think this needs a change. Maybe splitting the ratings in technical and creative. Because if a game is interesting but lacks polish, then the issue is fixable. But if a game is boring but perfectly polished, it's not. Many of the classic games most people love were buggy messes at release. But you never heard of boring games with high quality.
I came to quite the shocking conclusion.
There are many changes that were good, and for the whole genre maybe even late. For example, oh, look. Something happened in my life. So I paused the game and I can take care of it. What a genius idea. Pausing a game. I'm sorry, but being able to pause in a Soulslike was needed. When I played first Dark Souls as a teenager, I didn't give a fuck. But as a working adult, things happen that you need to take care of. It's sad to see how many Souls clones copied this from Dark Souls without question. Because I believe in Dark Souls this was done for invasions and the overall multiplayer and not difficulty. I find it more difficult to resume a fight after a lengthy pause. The genre needs this, and I know Elden Ring has a pause, but there is a few issues with that. First of all, it does not seem intended. It's more like tutorial screens make the game pause and you can access them from the menu. It's an oversight that became a feature. And secondly, it's not easy or fast. If you fight a boss or faster enemies, you might take a hit before you can pause the game. A pause should be a simple button press, not hoops and bumps I have to jump over.
Mon Dieu, what a disaster, Aegis. What a complete disaster.
Another thing is difficulty. Although I find the game a bit too easy, there is an assist mode. I also wish there was a hard mode, but just having the game more accessible is a big step up. There are certain kind of idiots thinking that Dark Souls has an easy mode. Just play Sorcerer. Just level perfectly. That's not an easy mode. An easy mode does not force a certain playstyle on you. For example, do you think your tax system in your country is overly complicated? Statistically, most people think that way, but there is an easy mode. Just pay an expert several $1,000s. You think the school route of your kids isn't safe enough? There's an easy way, just don't send your kids to school. It's the same level of stupidity. In easy mode is also not for the majority, it's for the less lucky minority.
Partout les saints! You were sent by heaven above!
Most people that watch this will be in their prime, probably under 50, both hands intact and no problems. But what we often forget is that there are less privileged people in this world. People born without thumbs. People with head trauma and so on. We often forget that those people also want to play games. And I think all Souls titles should have an easy mode. I'm not saying that the games should change, but you can do so much alone with number tweaking. Quartering all damage from enemies and doubling yours would already be an easy mode. You don't lose anything, but more people can enjoy video games. I usually don't talk about my family on this channel, but I want to give an anecdotal example. My mother also likes to play games. She enjoys RPGs and her favorite is Morrowind. She always plays on the easiest difficulty and still dies. It's not her fault. She's over 60 and nature takes its toll. And one time I landed her Dark Souls, but even though she liked the game, the combat proved to be too difficult for her. She wasn't raised with a PC or gaming like many in my generations did, and that makes it even more difficult. For these people, I think we need difficulty options. Life is already hard enough for many, and with simple tweaks we can at least make gaming a bit easier for them. As a last note, Steelrising is a decent game. It has problems like every game has, but there is a very good Souls core in this game. Farewell.